We continue Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough, by beginning Marcus Brutus. Marcus Brutus was descended from that Junius Brutus, to whom the ancient Romans erected a statue of brass in the Capitol among the images of their kings, with a drawn sword in his hand, in remembrance of his courage and resolution in expelling the Tarquins and destroying the monarchy. But that ancient Brutus was of a severe and inflexible nature, like steel of too hard a temper, and having never had his character softened by study and thought, he let himself be so far transported with his rage and hatred against tyrants, that, for conspiring with them, he proceeded to the execution even of his own sons. But this Brutus, whose life we now write, having to the goodness of his disposition added the improvements of learning and study, of philosophy, and having stirred up his natural parts of themselves, grave and gentle, by applying himself to business and public affairs, seems to have been of a temper exactly framed for virtue, insomuch that they who were most his enemies, upon account of his conspiracy against Caesar, if in that whole affair there was any honorable or generous part, referred it wholly to Brutus, and laid whatever was barbarous and cruel to the charge of Cassius. Brutus's connection and familiar friend, but not his equal in honesty and pureness of purpose. His mother, Servilia, was of the family of Servilius. Ahala, who when Spurius Malleus worked the people into a rebellion, and designed to make himself king, taking a dagger under his arm, went forth into the marketplace, and upon pretence of having some private business with him, came up close to him, and, as he bent his head to hear what he had to say, struck him with his dagger and slew him. And thus much as concerns his descent by his mother's side is confessed by all. But as for his father's family, they who for Caesar's murder bore any hatred or ill will to Brutus say that he came not from that Brutus who was expelled from the Tarquins, there being none of his race left till after the execution of his two sons, but that his ancestor was a plebeian, son of one Brutus, a steward, and only rose in the latest times to office or dignity in the Commonwealth. But Posidonius, the philosopher, writes that it is true indeed what the history relates, that two of the sons of Brutus, who were of men's estates, were put to death, but that a third, yet an infant, was left alive, from whom the family was propagated down to Marcus Brutus, and further, that there were several famous persons of this house in his time, whose looks very much resembled the statue of Junius Brutus. But of this subject enough. Cato, the philosopher, was brother to Servilia, the mother of Brutus, and it was whom of all the Romans his nephew most admired and studied to imitate, and he afterwards married his daughter Porcia. Of all the sects of the Greek philosophers, though there was none of which he had not been a hearer, and of which he had not made some proficiency, yet he chiefly esteemed the Platonists, and not much approving of the modern and middle academy, as it is called, he applied himself to the study of the ancient. He was all his lifetime a great admirer of Antiochus, of the city of Ascalon, and took his brother Aristus into his own house for his friend and companion, a man for his learning inferior indeed to many of the philosophers, but for the evenness of his temper, and steadiness of his conduct equal to the best. As for Ampulus, of whom he himself and his friends often make mention in their epistles as one that lived with Brutus, he was a rhetorician, and has left behind him a short but well-written history of the death of Caesar, entitled Brutus. In Latin, he had, by exercise, attained a sufficient skill to be able to make public addresses and to plead a cause, but in Greek he must be noted for affecting the sensuous and short laconic way of speaking in sundry passages of his epistles, as when in the beginning of the war he wrote thus to Pergamenians: I hear you have given Dolabella money. If willingly, you must own you have injured me. If unwillingly, show it by giving willingly to me. And another time to the Samians: your counsels are remiss, and your performances slow. What think ye will be the end? Well, that doesn't prove it either, because it's like, well, to prove it, you have to do this. Well, just because you do one thing authentically doesn't mean that the other thing is authentically. Another time, the Samians, your counsels are remiss, your performances show. What think you will be the end? And of the Patarians, thus the Xanthians, suspecting my kindness, have made their country the grave of the despair. The Patarians, trusting themselves to me, enjoy in all points their former liberty. It is in your power to choose the judgment of the Patarians on the pretense of the Xanthians. And this is the style for which some of his letters are to be noted. When he was but a very young man, he accompanied his uncle Cato to Cyprus, when he was sent there against Ptolemy. But when Ptolemy killed himself, well, we're having the suicides early, this one. Cato, being by some necessary business detained in the Isle of Rhodes, had already sent one of his friends, named Canidius, to take into his care in keeping the treasure of the king. But presently, not feeling sure of his honesty, he wrote to Brutus to sail immediately for Cyprus, out of Pamphylia, where he then was staying to refresh himself. Being but just recovered of a fit of sickness, he obeyed his orders, but with a great deal of unwillingness, as well out of respect to Canidius, who was thrown out of his employment by Cato with so much disgrace, as also because he esteemed such a commission mean and unsuitable to him, who was in the prime of his youth, and given to books and study. Nevertheless, applying himself to the business, he behaved himself so well in it that he was highly commended by Cato, and having turned all the goods of Ptolemy into ready money, he sailed with the greatest part of it in his own ship to Rome. But upon the general separation into two factions, when Pompey and Caesar taking up arms against one another, the whole empire was turned into confusion. It was commonly believed that he would take Caesar's side, for his father in past time had been put to death by Pompey, but he, thinking it his duty to prefer the interest of the public to his own private feelings, and judging Pompey to be the better cause, took part with him, though formerly he had used not so much as to salute or take any notice of Pompey, if he happened to meet him, esteeming it a pollution to have the least conversation with the murderer of his father. And yeah, that's totally understandable. But a murderer, period, right? But why are you having the conversation with a murderer? That's the more important thing. But now, Looking upon him as the general of his country, he placed himself under his command and set sail for Cilicia. In the quality of lieutenant to Cestius, who had the government of that province, but finding no opportunity there of doing any great service, and hearing that Pompey and Casar were now near one another, and preparing for the battle upon which all depended, he came of his own accord to Macedonia to partake in the danger. At his coming, it is said that Pompey was so surprised and so pleased that, rising from his chair in the sight of all who were about him, he saluted and embraced him as one of the chiefest of his party all the time that he was in the camp, excepting that which he spent in Pompey's company he employed in reading and in study, which he did not neglect even the day before the great battle. It was the middle of summer, and the heat was very great, the camp having been pitched near some marshy ground, and the people that carried Brutus's tent were a long while before they came. Yet, though upon these accounts he was extremely harassed and out of order, having scarcely by the middle of the day anointed himself and eaten a sparing meal, whilst most others were either laid to sleep or taken up with the thoughts and apprehensions of what would be the issue of the fight, he spent his time until the evening in writing an epitome of Polybius. It is said that Casar had so great a regard for him that he ordered his commanders by no means to kill Brutus in the battle, but to spare him, if possible, and bring him safe to him. If he would willingly surrender himself, but if he made any resistance, to suffer him to escape rather than to do him any violence. And this he is believed to have done out of a tenderness to Servilia, the mother of Brutus, for Casar had, it seems, in his youth, been very intimate with her, and she passionately in love with him, and considering that Brutus was born about that time in which their loves were at the highest, Casar had a belief that he was his own child. The story is told that when the great question of the conspiracy of Catiline, which had like to have been the destruction of the Commonwealth, was debated in the Senate, Cato and Casar were both standing up, contending together on the decision to become two, at which time a little note was delivered to Casar from without, which he took and read silently to himself. Well, one would think that having extramarital affairs, the idea of questions of parentage not being so cemented, or, there being doubts, that should be enough reason not to partake in such things, right? Upon this, Cato cried aloud, and accusing Casar of holding correspondence with and receiving letters from the enemies of the Commonwealth, and when many other senators exclaimed against it, Casar delivered the note as he had received it to Cato, who, reading it, found it to be a love letter from his own sister Servilia, and threw it back again to Casar with the words, "Keep it, you drunkard," and returned to the subject of the debate. So public and notorious was Servilia's love to Casar. After the great overthrow at Pharsalia, Pompey himself, having made his escape to the sea, and Casar's army storming the camp, Brutus stole privately out by one of the gates, leading to marshy ground full of water, and covered with reeds, and traveling through the night, got safe to Larissa. From Larissa, he wrote to Casar, who expressed a great deal of joy to hear that he was safe, and bidding him come, not only forgave him freely, but honored and esteemed him among his chiefest friends. Now, when nobody could give any certain account which way Pompey had fled, Casar took a little journey along with Brutus, and tried what was his opinion herein, and after some discussion which passed between them, believing that Brutus's conjecture was the right one, laying aside all other thoughts, he set out directly to pursue him towards Egypt, but Pompey, having reached Egypt, as Brutus guessed his design was to do, there met his fate. Brutus in the meantime gained Caesar's forgiveness for his friend Cassius, and pleading also in defense of the king of the Libyans, though he was overwhelmed with the greatness of the crimes alleged against him, yet by his entreaties and depreciations to Caesar in his behalf, he preserved to him a great part of his kingdom. It is reported that Caesar, when he first heard Brutus speak in public, said to his friends, "I know not what this young man intends, but whatever he intends vehemently." For his natural firmness of mind, not easily yielding or complying in favor of every one that entreated his kindness, once set in action upon motives of right reason and deliberate moral choice, whatever direction it thus took, it was pretty sure to take effectively, and to work in such a way as not to fail in its object. No flattery could ever prevail with him to listen to unjust petitions, and he held out that to be overcome by the importunities of shameless and fawning entreaties, though some compliment it with the name of modesty and bashfulness, was the worst disgrace a great man could suffer. And he used to say that he always felt as if they who could deny nothing could not have behaved well in the flower of their youth. Well, true as that is, same thing. And behaving is not just, it's not saying no to everything, it's not saying yes to everything. And also with what you believe and what you don't believe, it's not denying, it's not, accepting or rejecting everything either. Because certainly our language use is based on faith, right? Caesar, being about to make his expedition into Africa against Cato and Scipio, committed to Brutus the government of Cisalpine Gaul, to the great happiness and advantage of that province. For while people in other provinces were in distress with the violence and avarice of their governors, and suffered as much oppression as if they had been slaves and captives of war, Brutus, by his easy government, actually made them amends for their calamities under former rulers, directing, moreover, all their gratitude for his good deeds to Caesar himself, insomuch that it was a most welcome and pleasant spectacle to Caesar when, in his return, he passed through Italy. People would typically say Italy, but I'm not trying to do with the pronunciation there. To see the cities that were under Brutus's command, and Brutus himself increasing his honor and joining agreeably in his progress. Now several praetorships being vacant, it was all men's opinion that of the chiefest dignity, which is called the praetorship of the city, would be conferred either upon Brutus or Cassius, and some say that there having been some little difference upon former accounts between them, this competition set them much more at variance, though they were connected in their families, Cassius having married Junia, the sister of Brutus. Others say that the contention was raised between them by Caesar's doing, who had privately given each of them such hopes of his favor as led them on and provoked them at last into this open competition and trial of their interest. Brutus had only the reputation of his honor and virtue to oppose to the many ungallant actions performed by Cassius against the Parthians. But Caesar, having heard each side and deliberating about the matter among his friends, said, "Cassius has the stronger plea, but we must let Brutus be first praetor." So another praetorship was given to Cassius, the gaining of which could not so much oblige him as he was incensed for the loss of the other. And in all other things Brutus was partaker of Caesar's power as much as he desired, for he might, if he had pleased, have been the chief of all his friends, and had authority and command beyond them all. But Cassius and the company he met with him drew him off from Caesar. Indeed, he was not yet wholly reconciled to Cassius, since that competition which was between them, but yet he gave ear to Cassius's friends, who were perpetually advising him not to be so blind as to suffer himself to be softened and won over by Caesar, but to shun the kindness and favors of a tyrant, which they intimated that Caesar showed him, not to express any honor to his merit or virtue, but to unbend his strength and undermine his vigor of purpose. Neither was Caesar wholly without suspicion of him, nor wanted informers that accused Brutus to him, but he feared indeed the high spirit and the great character and the friends that he had, but thought himself secure in his moral disposition. When it was told him that Antenna and Dolabella designed some disturbance, "It is not," said he, "the fat and the long-haired men that I fear, but the pale and the lean," meaning Brutus and Cassius. And when some maligned Brutus to him, and advised him to beware of him, taking hold of his flesh with his hand, "What," he said, "do you think that Brutus will not wait out the time of this little body?" As if he thought none so fit to succeed him in his power as Brutus. And, indeed, it seems to be without doubt that Brutus might have been the first man in the Commonwealth if he had had patience, but a little time, to be second to Caesar, and would have suffered his power decline after it was come to its highest pitch, and the fame of his great actions to die away by degrees. But Cassius, a man of a fierce disposition, and one that out of a private malice, rather than love of the public, hated Caesar, not the tyrant, continually fired and stirred him up. Brutus felt the rule an oppression, but Cassius hated the ruler, and among other reasons on which he grounded his quarrel against Caesar, the loss of his lions, which he had procured when he was aedile elect, was one, for Caesar, finding these in Megara, when the city was taken by Calenus, seized them to himself. These beasts, they say, were a great calamity to the Megarians, for when their city was just taken, they broke open the lions' dens and pulled off their chains and let them loose, that they might run upon the enemy that was entering the city. But the lions turned upon them themselves and tore to pieces a great many unarmed persons running about, so that it was a miserable spectacle even to their enemies to behold. And this, some say, was the chief provocation that stirred up Cassius to conspire against Caesar. But they are much in the wrong, for Cassius had, from his youth, a natural hatred and rancor against the whole race of tyrants, which he showed when he was but a boy, and went to the same school with Faustus, the son of Sulla. For on his boasting himself amongst the boys and extolling the sovereign power of his father, Cassius rose up and struck him 2 or 3 boxes on the ear, which, when the guardians and relations of Faustus designed to inquire into and prosecute, Pompey forbade them, and sending for both the boys together, examined the matter himself. And Cassius is then reported to have said thus: "Come then, Faustus, dare to speak here those words that provoked me, that I may strike you again as I did before." Such was the disposition of Cassius. But Brutus was roused up and pushed on to the undertaking by many persuasions of his familiar friends, and letters and invitations from unknown citizens. For under the statue of his ancestor Brutus, that overthrew the kingly government, they wrote the words, "Oh that we had a Brutus now," and Oh, that Brutus were alive, and Brutus's own tribunal, on which he sat as praetor, was filled each morning with writings such as these: "You are asleep, Brutus," and "You are not a true Brutus." Now the flatterers of Caesar were the occasion of all this, who, among other ambiguous honors which they strove to fasten upon Caesar, crowned his statues by night with the diadems, wishing to incite the people to salute him king instead of a dictator. But quite the contrary came to pass, as I have more particularly related in the life of Caesar, when Cassius went about soliciting friends to engage in this design against Caesar, all whom had readily consented if Brutus would be head of it, for their opinion was that the enterprise wanted not hands or head of it, for their opinion was that the enterprise wanted not hands or resolution, but the reputation and authority of a man, such as he was, to give, as it were, the first religious sanction, and by his pretense, if by nothing else to justify the undertaking, that without him they should go about this action with less heart, and should lie under greater suspicions when they had done it. For if their cause had been just and honorable, people would be sure that Brutus would not have refused it. Cassius, having considered these things with himself, went to Brutus and made him the first visit after their falling out. And after the compliments of reconciliation had passed, and former kindnesses were renewed between them, he asked him if he designed to be present on the calends of March. For it was discoursed, he said, that Caesar's friends intended then to move that he might be made king, when Brutus answered that he would not be there. But what, says Cassius, if they should send for us? It will be my business then, replied Brutus, not to hold my peace, but to stand up boldly and die for the liberty of my country. To which Cassius, with some emotion, answered, but what Roman will suffer you to die? What, do you not know yourself, Brutus? Or do you think that those writings that you find upon your praetor's seat were put there by weavers and shopkeepers, and not by the first and most powerful men of Rome? From other praetors, indeed, they expect largesses and shows and gladiators, but from you, as they claim, as an hereditary debt, the extirpation of tyranny, they are all ready to suffer anything on your account. If you will but show yourselves such as they think you are, and expect you should be. Which said, he fell upon Brutus and embraced him, and after this they parted, each to try their several friends. Among the friends of Pompey there was one Caius Ligarius, whom Caesar had pardoned, though accused for having been in arms against him. Nowadays, if somebody's pardoned, people just presume they're innocent, even if they've never, been prosecuted. This man, not feeling so thankful for having been forgiven, as he felt oppressed by that power which made him need a pardon, hated Caesar, and was one of Brutus's most intimate friends. Him Brutus visited, and finding him sick, "O Ligarius," says he, "what a time you have found out to be sick in." At which words Ligarius, raising himself and leaning on his elbow, took Brutus by the hand and said, "But, O Brutus, if you are on any design worthy of yourself, I am well." From this time they tried the inclinations of all their acquaintances that they durst trust, and communicated the secret to them, and took into the design not only their familiar friends, but as many as they believed bold and brave, and despisers of death, for which reason they concealed the plot from Cicero, though he was very much trusted and as well beloved by them all, lest to his own disposition, which was naturally timorous, adding now the weariness and caution of old age, by his weighing as he would do every particular, that he might not make one step without the greatest security. He should blunt the edge of their forwardness and resolution in a business which required all the dispatch imaginable, as indeed there were also two others that were companions of Brutus, Statilius, the Epicurean, and Favonius, the admirer of Cato, whom he left out for this reason, as he was conversing one day with them, trying them at a distance, and proposing some such question to be disputed of as among philosophers, to see what opinion they were of. Favonius declared his judgment to be that the civil war was worse than the most illegal monarchy, and Statilius held that to bring himself into troubles and dangers upon the account of evil or foolish men did not become a man that had any wisdom or discretion. But Labeo, who was present, contradicted them both, and Brutus, as if it had been an intricate dispute, and difficult to be decided, held his peace for that time, but afterwards discovered the whole design to Labeo, who readily undertook it. The next thing that was thought convenient was to gang the other Brutus, surnamed Albinius, a man of himself, of no great bravery or courage, but considerable for the number of gladiators that he was maintaining for a public show, and the great confidence that Caesar put in him. When Cassius and Labeo spoke with him concerning the matter, he gave them no answer, but seeking an interview with Brutus himself alone, and finding that he was their captain, he readily consented to partake in the action, and among the others also the most and best were gained by the name of Brutus, and though they neither gave nor took any oath of secrecy, nor used any other sacred rite to assure their fidelity to each other, yet all kept their design so close, were so wary, and held it so silently among themselves, that though by prophecies and apparitions and signs in the sacrifices the entities gave warning of it, yet could it not be believed. Well, it's not always the entities, but people take whatever sign. Oh, I'm worshiping this, so that's what's answering me, or I'm interpreting this in this context. See, that's the thing that actually does your answer. Through the oracles and stuff, you answer yourself. That's what you can rely on. I'm not saying people don't have experiences sent from various things, but sometimes, regardless of what the authorities are saying, people are like, yeah, I don't think that's the things that you prayed to answering you. Now Brutus, feeling that the noblest spirits of Rome for virtue, birth, or courage were depending upon him, and surveying with himself all the circumstances of the dangers they were to encounter, strove indeed as much as possible when abroad to keep his uneasiness of mind to himself and to compose his thoughts, but at home, and especially at night, he was not the same man, but sometimes against his will his working care would make him start out of his sleep, and other times he was taken up with further reflection and consideration of his difficulties, so that his wife, that lay with him, could not choose but take notice that he was full of unusual trouble, and had in agitation some dangerous and perplexing question. Porcia, as was said before, was the daughter of Cato, and Brutus, her cousin german, had married her very young, though not a maid, but after the death of her former husband, by whom she had one son, that was named Bibulus, and there is a little book called Memoirs of Brutus, written by him, yet extant. This Porcia, being addicted to philosophy, a great lover of her husband, and full of an understanding courage, resolved not to inquire into Brutus's secrets before she had made this trial of herself. She turned of all her attendants out of her chamber, and taking a little knife, such as they used to cut nails with, she gave herself a deep gash in the thigh, upon which followed a great flow of blood, and soon after violent pains and a shivering fear occasioned by the wound. Now, when Brutus was extremely anxious and, afflicted for her, she, in the height of all her pain, spoke thus to him: I, Brutus, being the daughter of Cato, was given to you in marriage, not like a concubine, to partake only in the common intercourse of bed and board, but to bear a part in all your good and all your evil fortunes. And for your part, as regards your care for me, I find no reason to complain. But from me, and what evidence of my love, what satisfaction can you receive, if I may not share with you in bearing your hidden griefs, nor to be admitted to any of your counsels that require secrecy and trust? And the character thing of Brutus being something that